But now on Radio 4, Poison in the Womb. Kerry Hudson uncovers the story of the DES drug disaster and its consequences for the women prescribed it, along with their children.
Thank you, members of Scottish Parliament, for letting me speak today. My name is Caitlin McCarthy. I am a DES daughter. Today,
in 2022, there was a hearing in the Scottish Parliament asking for an apology and acknowledgement of the exposure risks for women and their children who were given the drug DES. That's Diethylstilbesterol, also known as Stilbesterol in the UK. It was a synthetic estrogen meant to ensure a healthy pregnancy and prevent miscarriage. But it was later determined to be a carcinogen and poisoned children before they were even born.
No controlled studies were ever conducted by the drug companies.
If you haven't heard of this drug, you're not alone. Until I was contacted by the BBC to tell the story, I also had never heard of it. Despite it being given to millions of women globally, often with serious health implications for them, their children, and even their children's children. It's known as the silent thalidomide. In this programme, we aim to uncover what DES is, what it did to generations of women, and why they deserve acknowledgement and an apology. This is DES, Poison in the Womb. I'm Kerry Hudson.
There is absolutely no doubt in my mind, people in Scotland and in the rest of the UK have been harmed by this drug, and we cannot continue to sweep it under the carpet.
This is Marion Scott, chief reporter at the Sunday Post, a campaigner for women's rights and health, and one of the very few people consistently covering DES exposure.
One of the reasons that I think it's very, very important to take this up now is that many of the women that were given this drug back in the 40s and the 50s and up to the 70s would not have known that they'd been given this drug.
The consequences of being given this drug could be extreme.
The side effects of DES can produce very rare cancers, it can produce deformities within the reproductive system, it can cause infertility that we're now seeing all across the world. The reason why it is very important that Scotland takes the lead in this is that we can move quickly and do something about this. We can raise awareness and tell people that may have been affected by this, and there could be many, many thousands out there who do not know that they could have been affected by this drug.
There are DES mothers, women initially given the drug, and DES sons and daughters, the children of these women who were affected by the drug in vitro. For many of the DES children, it is not until they start to exhibit symptoms that they find out the truth about their condition. This story for you began at the age of 35. Can you tell us a little bit about your diagnosis?
It was May 18th, 2005, the day after my father's birthday.
This is Caitlin McCarthy. She is a DES daughter, educator, award-winning screenwriter and campaigner. She was referred to a specialist gynecologist in Boston as she had been experiencing some precancerous cell activity.
And within 2 seconds of looking at me, that doctor asked me, "What year were you born?" And that's not the kind of question you want to hear during that sort of examination. I shared with him that it was 1970, and then he asked me this chilling question, "Did your mother take anything while pregnant with you?" I didn't know the answer, but I told him my mom was in the waiting room, that he could ask her. My mom took her time coming down the hallway. It was almost like Poltergeist, where the hallway gets longer and longer and longer and longer. She knew that question wasn't good. He asked her if she had been prescribed DES, and she said no, because to her knowledge, she hadn't been. He asked her, "Did you experience any bleeding while pregnant with your daughter?" And she said yes. He then asked her, "Were you prescribed a prenatal vitamin?" And she said yes. Bingo.
Caitlin's mother, Annie, hadn't even been told what was really in that mix of vitamins. It was a deeply shocking moment for both mother and daughter.
Both of my parents felt enormous guilt about my DES exposure. They had gone out of their way to obtain the best medical care possible, and to find out that the drug that she thought would, help her pregnancy actually hurt her child, crushed her.
Can you tell us exactly what the impact of the drug has been on your body and your health?
I do know that I have what they call a hooded cervix. The technical term is a coxcomb. It looks as if there's a turtleneck around my cervix, and I have had precancerous cell activity that they keep an eye on.
Not to mention the emotional impact.
It's something that I live with daily, wondering, could something happen to me? But I do find that by being an activist, I feel less out of control with it and more in control with it.
Caitlin, reeling from the news, began writing a feature film script, Wonder Drug, now in production, just 2 days after finding out her diagnosis. Another way to understand and take control of the story of what had happened to her. As part of her research, she contacted the family of DES's creator, Sir Charles Dodds.
I was extremely fortunate to connect with the late Sir Ralph Dodds, who was the son of Sir Charles Dodds. I initially was connected with him by the Apothecary Society, or the official term is the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries of London. I love the way British people describe things. I had written to them and they had forwarded my email to Sir Ralph, and he responded to me. And you can imagine what I thought when I saw his name in my inbox, because I thought, oh my gosh, I'm a DES victim. I'm an American. He's going to be wondering what are my motives. But he trusted me from the beginning. And he and his wife, Lady Marian, invited me to come visit them. He opened his home to me. He opened his heart to me, shared his memories with me, showed me letters and photos of his dad.
It would be easy to imagine a monster had created this drug. But instead, Caitlin was introduced to a deeply human and deeply regretful creator who believed he was making the world a better place.
His father had the best intentions with DES. He never intended it for pregnant women. It was intended, when he was developing it under a grant that didn't allow for patents, for menopausal women for short-term use. Because prior to his discovery, estrogen therapy was very painful. It was done through injections. It was extremely expensive. And there were some overdoses with women. So DES came along, and it was cheap to make, easy to use, and he thought he was doing a service. You publish a chemical structure that's unpatented, drug companies can run wild with it, and they did.
Do you know what his reaction was to how his creation was used?
When I was over in London doing my initial research, I accessed letters that Charles Dodds had written about the thalidomide scandal. And he had expressed relief that nothing like that had happened with DES. But you could read between the lines that it was in the back of his mind that he was thinking, oh my gosh, thalidomide was given to pregnant women, DES was given to pregnant women. You could tell that he was terrified something was going to happen. He died in 1973. The cancer cases came out in 1971. Ralph told me that his father was absolutely devastated because he was knighted for his creation. If you look at his crest at the Apothecary Society, it contains the chemical structure for DES. In fact, his crest is the first one to ever contain a chemical structure.
Looking at the window, it is a beautiful stained glass crest in blue with flashes of red and yellow. Your eye is drawn to 2 crabs representing cancer, impaled by golden swords, and the, in retrospect, heartbreaking motto, deeds, not thoughts.
He thought he had done a good thing, and to die knowing that he had opened Pandora's box, that had to be absolutely devastating.
The drug would have implications for millions globally. In Scotland, as in the rest of the UK, it had many applications. Marion Scott again.
This drug was used in pregnancy, where women suffered a history of miscarriage. It was given to them. It was also given to women who had problems with fertility and conception.
Perhaps one of the most brutal examples of the use of DES is in the forced adoption scandal. In Scotland alone, we know that more than 60,000 women had their babies forcibly removed from them just because they weren't married. Many of these women were also given DES to dry up their breast milk.
So, among with the worst thing that you could possibly do to a mother, you're administering to them a poison that can not only affect them, but also future children and grandchildren that they may have.
Overall, we can't know how many women were given DES in Scotland or the rest of the UK. But certainly the forced adoption scandal gives us a sense of the scale at which it was prescribed. Marion Scott met a survivor of both forced adoption and DES 10 years ago. Coincidentally, she is also called Marion.
I met Marion Macmillan, and she told me she was given this drug very, very callously, just to facilitate taking her baby away as quickly as possible so that it could be handed on to someone else.
This was a time when doctors were not questioned. Marion Macmillan says she remembers drugs being given out like sweeties on the ward.
Some of the women were actually asking to be given the drug because it was the only way that they could stop the pain in their breasts, and also they wanted to get out of these terrible homes as quickly as possible. They weren't told what the drugs were, they weren't told what they could do, they weren't told what possible side effects they could be. She remembers speaking to many, many women years later who always had this fear about what were we given.
Just what they had been given, became clear to the world with a study that was published in 1971.
It was April 21st. I was 17 and a half years old, and my parents bought the Boston Globe, and there was an article missing from the front page. And I asked my mother, what was taken out of the page, and she wouldn't tell me. I went into the Boston Public Library, and I was able to go and find out what was missing from the front of the paper, and it was the first published story about the link between DES and vaginal cancer in young women.
Andrea Gardner is a retired nurse and DES daughter from the United States. She has been involved in DES advocacy and campaigning since the late 70s. Despite her initial panic about cancer or infertility, she was assured by her doctor that if sperm can get in, you can get pregnant.
In the fall of 1976, I was having these recurrent episodes of bleeding followed by pain. On November 11th, early in the morning, I woke up in excruciating pain, and my husband drove me into the hospital.
It was discovered that she was having an ectopic pregnancy, where the fetus implants outside the womb. At that time, the only treatment was complete removal of the affected area, most commonly the fallopian tube.
I did not know that I was pregnant until I woke up, and then I was told by him. He was a very patient, kind man, and he was, very upbeat and said, "You have 2 fallopian tubes, you only need 1 to get pregnant, and not to worry about it." And so I didn't.
She and her husband started trying in earnest to have a baby and consulted a fertility specialist.
He explained to me a doctor in Texas, Dr. Raymond Kaufman, had just done a study of 76 DES daughters. He had done dye x-rays of their uterine cavities, and he had found that all of them had some level of deformity. And from that, we learned DES was doing more than possibly causing vaginal and cervical adenocarcinoma. It had also affected the reproductive system.
Her doctor scheduled her for an x-ray.
And I went back for the results, and he said to me, "I've never seen an x-ray this bad before. Your uterine cavity is practically non-existent." And then he said, "I don't think that you will ever have a successful pregnancy. You can imagine that at 24 or 25 years old, that's certainly not something I ever expected to hear."
Although this led to a dark time in her life, Andrea found new resilience in joining a community of DES activists, mothers and daughters who could understand her situation.
It was very empowering for me because I felt that I could help myself. No one likes to be a victim. I didn't want to be a victim.
In 1978, there was a hearing about the impact of DES held by Senator Ted Kennedy.
Suddenly, I was in Washington, D.C. I had spent many, many hours writing my little 3-minute speech and deciding how I was going to present it. And when it was my turn, I got up, I held my x-ray up, I waved it around because I wanted people to see it. I wanted people to understand because nobody did at the time. And I passed it around the room. And what I remember most was the disinterest of the people sitting around that table, including those who were looking at their watches, and one who said he hoped he'd make the dinner flight.
A central thread of this whole story is medical misogyny and dismissal. At this time, there were a few lawsuits regarding cancer linked to DES. However, Andrea was the very first woman to bring about a case due to the links to infertility.
My lawsuit was filed against Eli Lilly because Eli Lilly made about 99% of the DES.
In 1984, her case was finally heard. She went before Judge Walter Skinner in Boston Federal Court for a 2-week trial.
Eli Lilly's attorneys wanted to convince the jury that the reason why I had ectopic pregnancies was because I had had a sexually transmitted disease. 3 of my doctors testified. All 3 of them were gynecologic surgeons. All 3 of them had operated on me. All testified that I had no evidence of a sexually transmitted disease.
2 pathologists were brought in to examine slides of Andrea's fallopian tubes. After 5 operations in 5 years, including the removal of her remaining fallopian tube, this was a further indignity.
One pathologist hired by my attorneys, the other hired by Eli Lilly's attorneys. They both looked at the same thing, but they came to different conclusions. The one who said I had a sexually transmitted disease, and the other who said that this was congenital, likely caused by the DES. However, the judge decided that the jury did not have to hear that testimony, and so that never came out during the trial.
But how do you begin to recompense a lifetime's trauma and the loss of the future you imagined for yourself?
The jury awarded me $50,000. While that might have seemed like a lot of money then, I had 2 law firms. I had to split any award 3 ways. In addition, the judge decided to strike down one of the ectopic pregnancies.
Andrea didn't want to take it. She considered it blood money.
At the 4-year mark, my lawyer sat me down and said I needed to settle. If I didn't, the case would automatically be remanded for a new trial. Because I had the first DES infertility trial, and it did not go well from the perspective of the lawyers, I couldn't find another lawyer to do it. And so under pressure, I did settle and walked away with $15,000.
$15,000.
After my case, DES lawyers started to settle DES infertility cases. And this was a way to sort of ensure that these women would get something, because unfortunately, my case was supposed to set a precedent, and it didn't do that. So many of us really got robbed, not once by the drug, but again by the legal system.
Comparatively, despite studies as early as 1953, which showed DES might actually cause more miscarriages than it prevented, there has been little attention in the UK. Here's Marion again.
There was no tracking of patients, there was no data, there was no government warnings to let people know what had happened and what the dangers were. There was just this long, stony silence.
People were simply left to find out for themselves.
I don't believe that women in Scotland became properly aware until Marion Macmillan began speaking out. She began researching the drug, and she began to realise the dreadful side effects and the importance of making sure that people knew what was happening. She felt that she had to warn them so that they could have their health checked and make sure that they get the best treatment possible if they were one of the ones who were unlucky enough to be diagnosed with cancer.
Marion Macmillan is, of course, a very conspicuous absent voice here, and perhaps emblematic of the fact that after decades of tireless campaigning, time is running out for DES-exposed women to receive acknowledgement and apology.
It's of the greatest sadness that Marion Macmillan is not here today to speak for herself, but Marion is dying of cancer, and to this day she does not know and cannot prove whether DES was the cause.
Before she became too ill, Marion was campaigning for a public apology that acknowledged not just the forced adoption scandal, but specifically the use of DES. Marion, the journalist, and Marion, the campaigner, drew support from a global community.
So we had a very long discussion about DES and my experience as a DES daughter, because the awareness in the UK isn't quite as large as it is here in the United States. I was then invited to record a testimony about DES and why an apology is much needed.
Nurses and healthcare providers have never been properly educated on DES. Some view it as a dead issue, even though DES victims are very much alive. And emerging evidence shows the damage is generational.
I am so ready for the Scottish apology that I have bought tartaned to wear when they issue the apology. I'm ready.
This has been supported across the political spectrum, spearheaded in Holyrood by Monica Lennon of the Labour Party and Miles Briggs of the Conservatives, and in Westminster by Dr. Lisa Cameron of the SNP. So it has support across the board. And yet there are still few tangible results from this campaigning.
We hoped that that would be enough to encourage the Scottish Government to be the first in the world to have an inquiry, to make an apology, but it seems to have stalled at the moment. They've done it back to front. They've been spending thousands and thousands of pounds on finding out how many people are affected, a scoping programme.
Research of this kind can take years, and these are years that these women simply don't have.
We and others have learnt from studies of this type that they are generally difficult, but they may not be impossible. I'm Alison Venn, I'm an epidemiologist, and I'm Professor Emerita at the Menzies Institute for Medical Research at the University of Tasmania here in Australia.
DES was not only used for fertility, but also psychosocial or cosmetic reasons. In Australia, women known as the tall girls were prescribed it mostly by private practitioners, as estrogen naturally inhibits growth. Back then, tallness was seen as a medical issue. Women who had been given this treatment began to come forward as potential side effects emerged.
Among the many concerns they were raising quite publicly in the media, they felt that there was a need for a long-term follow-up study.
At this point, Alison was predominantly working in the area of cancer associated with IVF. She met with the women and she and her team subsequently devised a study.
We focused on outcomes that were of concern to the women themselves and those that were deemed to be plausibly, potentially associated with treatment. Fertility problems were concerns that a lot of women expressed. Quite a lot of women had experienced fertility problems. So that was a really primary focus for the study. But we were also interested in psychosocial outcomes, satisfaction with treatment, mental health, and also breast health.
Finding affected women in the first place was challenging because, as in the UK, records in Australia were usually only kept for a few years.
We were able to identify a total of just over 1,400 girls who had been medically assessed for tall stature and their potential eligibility for treatment. And we were able to track down just over 1,200 of them, which was a pretty amazing effort. The final group of women who agreed to participate included 371 who had been treated. 151 of them were treated with DES.
Another difficulty, of course, is that you're asking women to remember events from decades earlier in their lives.
Obviously, people are very good at remembering if they got pregnant and when they had a baby, but it's not so easy to remember exactly how long it took to get pregnant when people were actively trying. So we had to really do very detailed history taking to actually take women back through at what point were they trying and how many months of attempting to get pregnant did they have before they actually achieved a pregnancy. So that detailed history taking and relying on recollection of events that might have happened, that's quite challenging in a study like this.
It was a small sample, but with a convincing outcome.
Not only were women more likely to see a doctor because they were having difficulty conceiving, they were also more likely to have treatment. And even those who did not report difficulties conceiving, we found that they did take longer to conceive. So whichever way we looked at it, and we did the analysis in all kinds of ways to try and rule out potential bias, the findings seemed pretty robust and consistent. There was more infertility in the treated group.
Ultimately, individual women could not know if their infertility was caused by exposure to DES or not. What they could know was that their cohort had a greater risk. Alison is keen to stress that women who think they've been exposed to DES should not be overly alarmed. Adverse effects were more common, but not inevitable. The main point is there is plenty of evidence about the impact of DES from across the decades and across the globe.
Just because there hasn't been a study in one place doesn't mean the findings from another country, for example, can't be generalisable to a different situation. And we also have to, recognise that some questions are going to be very difficult to answer and may never be answered. But, we do have a pretty good evidence base around a lot of the key questions already.
So, why no apology?
I think there's kind of two issues here. One is the science, and then there's a whole range of other issues about So what then is done about that? And often that's out of the hands of the scientists. That's a whole other set of difficult questions, and I accept that there's frustrations for people who feel that much more should be done to A, recognise that harm was done, and B, to compensate in some way for that, whether that be through apologies or some other mechanism.
What would you want to say to anyone in the UK if they think they're DES exposed? What would you want to tell them?
Well, the first thing that needs to happen is a conversation, if it's possible, with your mother. Ask the question, were you prescribed anything while you were pregnant with me? Was it DES? Was it stilbesterol? Were you experiencing any bleeding? Did you have a history of miscarriage before me? You have to be a Sherlock Holmes in a way. Many doctors destroyed their records within 7 years, but there are some doctors who save everything. So if you're able to track down the doctor, maybe they have your mother's file somewhere in their basement. You can take a look at the years you were born, because DES was mainly prescribed from 1947 up until the mid-'80s in parts of Europe. So if you're born in that time period and you're experiencing fertility issues, if you've had breast cancer, if you've had any precancerous cell activity and they're not connecting it to HPV, they don't know why it's happening to you, you may be a DES daughter. Ask your gynecologist to perform the special DES pap smear, and the guidelines for that can be found on the DES Action website, desaction.org. You can also get in touch with many of the DES activists. We love to talk, if you haven't guessed, with me. So we'll answer you if you find us on Twitter or Facebook. And don't be embarrassed. The only people who should be embarrassed are the ones covering this up within the drug companies. They're the ones who should be ashamed, not you.
Marion again.
I hope that the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government will say sorry to the women who were given this drug. And I hope that they will follow that up by making sure that there is an awareness campaign throughout Scotland. And if they do that, I think then we will see action right across the UK.
It's not just about the global problem, but individual people who have been exposed to this drug with no accountability or closure.
I think Marion McMillan is one of the most inspirational and brave women I've ever met. She has spent the last 40 years helping hundreds and hundreds of women, not just here in Scotland, but across the UK and across the world. She's now dying of cancer. It is absolutely imperative that before she dies, that she hears those words, "We are sorry for what happened." I think she deserves to hear that so that she can go to her rest knowing that she did her best.
After decades of medical gaslighting, misogyny and dismissal, surely an apology is the least that women like Marion, Caitlin, Andrea and so many more deserve. Thankfully, there is research available and public figures engaging with this issue. But we can't allow more years to pass before we see a conclusion to the story of this wonder drug.
Poison in the Womb was presented by Kerry Hudson and produced by Elizabeth Ann Duffy. Since the completion of this programme, the Scottish Parliament have announced plans to apologise for the forced adoption scandal. Whether that apology will include DES is unknown. Details of organisations that can provide support with cancer and pregnancy-related issues are available at bbc.co.uk/actionline.